Welcome everyone. Today we have our new episodes on mobile computing, and this is our 306th episode. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Edwards, Professor Rob, and Professor David Smith. So we will discuss on mobile computing. This is very, very important for us, especially in the COVID-19 situation. I think everybody uh, engaged with that kind of technology. So I want to start from Professor David Smith. How do you want to analyze today's topic? And what great example you want to share with our audience?
Sure. Thank you so very much. To me, mobile computing is almost misnomer today because what we really have is anywhere computing almost at any time today. Uh, and the fact that in many environments, our mobile computing is invisible to us. And that to me is one of the signs of very good design for mobile computing. I love to ask people, tell me a device that costs over $100, takes power, and doesn't have a chip in it. And the reality is there's very few of them out there that do that. So as we look at the ubiquity of computing, it's really there and is very broad, and is one that we have to understand and do it explicitly, though, with human-centric computing, which I think is really more where you're asking the question around. What I think we've seen is that the human interaction has been able to not only go up during the COVID crisis, but we've begun to see more and more services to begin to help it be more acceptable to people. Little things like on most of the video conferencing platforms today, there's now things with your virtual background. You can blur the background. There's enhancements to the other elements like that, which I think will continue to grow. One of the wild cards, though, in mobile computing is how does mobile computing integrate with the digital world around you? With the growth of the Internet of Things, with the growth of smart endpoints, with the growth of edge computing, moving the processing to the edge of the cloud, moving the sensing to the edge of the cloud, it will continue to enhance what we do in mobile computing. If I go back and look at one other element on it, and we're seeing mobile computing catch up on this one a whole lot, is if you look at the decision chain you have in using the mobile computing or using any type of computing. You start with data, you take data, turn it into information. That information turns into knowledge, then into wisdom, and then into action. In the past, a lot of the mobile environment never got up to the wisdom part of being able to drive action. And what we're seeing today is, particularly with the power of our mobile devices, we're being able to move more of that decision making, more of the artificial intelligence, more of those tools that make that possible down to the end mobile devices. If I just think of my phone and I compare that to the computers I saw in spacecraft at NASA even just a couple of years ago, I have more power here than in most of what we have on satellites today. And so that is, to me, part of the way this whole mobile computing experience is changing. And I tend to use mobile devices because you've heard me say before that what domain is your smart device in? Is it a phone? Is it a computer? Is it a location device? Is it an entertainment device? Is it a GPS device? What is it? And we're seeing that increasingly with all of our other resources as we look at our mobile environment and how ubiquitous it's becoming. So that's my initial framing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Talib, joining with us, and Professor Donald and Manuel. Thank you for joining today. Uh, Professor Rob, how do you want to analyze today's topic?
Well, I've been covering mobile computing going back to its very beginning in the 1980s, and it's been kind of an interesting ride. The initial goal was just to make computers so that they were portable, and my first mobile computer was a Panasonic Senior Partner that weighed in at a whopping 35 pounds and had a built-in thermal printer that I must have used at least twice. And then we evolved to making them smaller and lighter. That was through the 90s, but battery life sucked. We had the IBM, very innovative IBM laptop with a butterfly keyboard, the original butterfly keyboard, which actually opened and spread, making the laptop really small and portable. But you measured battery life in terms of minutes, not hours, and the end result, and it had an underpowered processor, which made the experience rather miserable, and it was expensive. If I remember correctly, it was around $4,500 in 1990s dollars. So it was a pricey toy, but it took us down a path of innovation. Beginning in the 90s, we got to incredibly thin laptops. Still, battery life sucked. The Sony Vios are probably the most aggressive in terms of design. We still have one here sitting around someplace, but it's almost paper thin. But the issue still was battery life. And then as we got into the 2000s, we started to really work on battery life, and a lot of the early work on battery life and really getting them past nickel metal hydride and into lithium ion set a foundation for the same technology to be used in autonomous vehicles. If we hadn't done that work with mobile computers, we undoubtedly would not have had that technology available for electric cars. And though if you look at electric cars, their biggest problem, of course, is battery life. And in the end, that's one of the things that's really kind of gauged mobile computing is the limitations of portability, the ability to supply power, the ability to supply connectivity, and the ability to provide enough screen real estate that you can get the work done. I know in my own case, I have real trouble going to a mobile computer even today when you can get screens up to 17 inches because I work on a screen here it's nearly 50 inches. And so going to much smaller real estate is problematic for me. So I noticed that affects my work. The one thing that mobile computers did play a very big role in, of course, as you mentioned as we started, was when we pivoted to the new COVID-19 normal where people had to work from home and companies and schools had to shift their management, their technology, and everything else in a matter of days. From being on-premise to being remote, we learned who was set up for this stuff and who wasn't. And what we also learned is those companies that were aggressive in terms of supporting mobile work and those schools that were aggressive in terms of supporting students that couldn't come into school were able to pivot far more quickly than the organizations that were not, because they'd already developed the methods, the infrastructure, the support to make that happen. Yesterday, I interviewed two schools, two school districts, one in Colorado and one in Texas, about how they successfully pivoted to mobile. Both of them used Cisco as their partner for the pivot. But some of the stories were just really interesting. As for instance, the school in Texas received a $30 million grant from the federal government to make the conversion. The state of Texas took the grant away from them, promising them to give them an equivalent amount of money, which is yet to show up. So they actually had to go out and issue bonds to fund the move to mobile. And a lot of the mistakes they made early on, which were common across the industry, were doing things like sending out old used computers into the field and not realizing that when you send out thousands of things that are not consistent with each other, you're going to have a serious support problem. And one of the things they decided to do, if they were to do this again, is make sure their staff was trained in terms of supporting folks, because when they thought that they would deploy these mostly old Apple computers to the field, they had no idea the support load that they had. They were figuring no support, Apple's easy, everybody would be able to do this. And they were taking 80 support calls a day, and really not having the staff to handle those calls created a minor catastrophe. So the advice was find a partner that can support you, find a partner that can scale. They also had an issue with the fact that the people that were configuring the machines couldn't handle the load, and so they couldn't get the machines out very quickly. Oh, and one really interesting thing they discovered was they had no idea what the students were going through. A lot of the areas in both Colorado and Texas don't have good high bandwidth Wi-Fi coverage or wired coverage. In fact, in the Texas areas, they talked about having, you'd have a plot of land, they'd place a bunch of house trailers on it. House trailers were served by one water hose, 1 meter, and no internet. And a lot of the folks didn't have any money, so it's not like they could afford anything either. And they discovered when they sent these computers home, not only didn't anybody know how to do anything with them, like log in, they were afraid to experiment because the computer was the most expensive thing they had in the household. And it was through that understanding they realized they needed to spin up very different services, training, and in some cases actually put in place some in-person outdoor event so that the students could get FaceTime, and so they could actually get down and kind of help with some of these issues. So it's been an interesting learning experience. And in the end, this pandemic has moved us probably 5 years farther into this supporting mobile folks and helping them perform remotely. The video conferencing systems that they're using both in businesses and schools have massively improved over this pandemic. So it's this pandemic, granted, it's a dark cloud, but it had an interesting silver lining because we've also discovered that people don't have to be at work to be productive. And both businesses and schools have discovered that students and teachers some actually perform better when they're remote. So providing that flexibility has provided an uptick in productivity. I should add with one more thing before we move on. One of the fascinating things is we all thought productivity was at least to some degree when people went remote and mobile, and it's gone up. But the sacrifice has been work-life balance. So that's just another problem to solve. So it's been an interesting path, but we are now far more mobile than we ever have been, and we're seeing advances in things like batteries and head-mounted displays that promise additional advancements and capabilities for the future.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you, Professor Edward. I'm really happy because for today's discussions, we have world-famous policymaker, world-famous business analyst, even great politicians, great professors, and even some young and like those who have plan to change the world. I'm really happy that today's session will be very productive, and I request all of our audience, this kind of session you should share in between your communities, with your government, with your corporations, as well as in your academia. Professor Edward, how do you want to share your analysis on mobile computing?
Okay, well, this has so far been an interesting discussion, and I mean, Rob and David have excellent insights that I certainly agree with. I can only be on for this segment. I have some other things to do, but a couple of things that come out of this. First of all, I'll mention that my first mobile computer, if you want to call it that, was an old metal K-Pro, which is like this big metal thing that you carried around and had a keyboard, and it was big and bulky, and you had to put in the little discs and so forth. And that was our idea in the late 80s of a mobile computer. Of course, we progressed a lot from that. One of the other things we had very, very early on, and some of you gentlemen might recall this, is remote access. So when we finally started to get primitive laptops, well, you know what I could do? I could actually access my desktop computer at work. So if I were, if I were traveling on the road, well, in a sense, I had mobile computing because I could access the desktop. I would have to sometimes even plug it into a phone line to get that. So it wasn't exactly the best approach, but that was the primitive technology. Of course, today we have laptops, smartphones, and so many things interconnected. I think that David's point is quite important, that really what you're seeing and the importance of this is not just being able to have this conference, but as we see mobile computing more and more integrating into the Internet of Things. So it's not just a matter of we can communicate, or that I can do what I do with my my smartphone. I do calculations on here. I do other stuff. I send documents to my colleagues to say, can you check this over real quick? They check it, they send it back. I say, oh, great, it looks good. So it's really going to be the mobile computing integrating with the Internet of Things, which, of course, if you're in one of the Asian Pacific countries, this is very good for you because right now we're having a very interesting conversation about technology and policy. But of course, what's going on elsewhere is that businesses are having similar conversations, that enterprises and entrepreneurs in Malaysia and Bangladesh and so forth are doing this sort of thing with colleagues in California and in Arizona. And, the question of, who is drinking the coffee to wake up and who is trying to keep awake from falling asleep because they're 12 hours difference is another issue. But that's going to be the reality. I'll mention two other quick points here. Again, one of the most important things, of course, about advanced technology is to control the manufacturing and business process. And a lot of that, of course, is done automatically. But the idea that to what extent is the computing going to remain in the factory, let's say, or if I have designed something that I want to be printed out in bulk on a 3D computer, or I'm sorry, a 3D printer in some manufacturing facility, to what extent are the people in the facility or associated with the facility going to be able to work even if they're not physically there? I'll end on another personal note here because we talked about education, and since I have two 10-year-old daughters, last year, of course, when COVID hit, suddenly the schools had to go remote, and we had similar problems, perhaps not as dramatic as Rob and David have discussed, and David especially, about how many students actually had internet access, how many students had good internet access. Some of us had laptops, so I could get one of my daughters on this laptop, and I could get another daughter on an old computer that we happened to have around the house. The schools had to struggle very quickly to, first of all, figure out how to get devices to everybody. Second, how to set up the system itself. And it's still in Montgomery County, Maryland. We're a very prosperous county in the United States, right outside of Washington, D.C. So generally, we have good internet access, Wi-Fi access, though not as good as you would like. But one of the big problems was, again, setting up the system so that the teacher could say, well, okay, for this assignment, you have to go to this particular portal to get the assignment. And if you want to do a certain assignment and turn it in, you have to go to another portal. So there was a lot of confusion because the systems weren't integrated. And in the second semester, the system was better integrated, but still not as good. Our semester just ended 2 days ago, and I had to go back and forth with the teacher saying, now, did this assignment get turned in? Because we went to this portal and we couldn't get it to work. So then we had to go to do this other thing. And so it was still a bit clunky. But again, I think what has been said, especially I think by Rob, is very important, that the pandemic has really pushed us ahead several years, maybe 5 years, in integrating mobile devices, making sure that they're working, making sure that students in rural Texas can actually have access to them and actually know what to do with them. And so if you want to say that there's any kind of a silver lining or a good side to this terrible pandemic, it really has pushed us in the direction of having more mobile access. And again, when we integrate more into the Internet of Things with wearable devices and so forth, it's going to be even more important. And again, thank you for another excellent show. I'm sorry I have to bail out early. I have my own internet computing to do here, but Rob and David have been excellent. I'm sure our other guests will do the same. So, gentlemen,
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye, Don.
Thank you. Dr. Talib Raphael, you have a lot of experience, especially in politics and like the United Nations and all of the big organizations you run. So one thing is very important right now. We have a lot of challenges, especially internet connections, and even though in the developing nations, how many students get laptops or mobile computings and other things, like how we can solve this problem. Even actually many countries I know, last 14 to 15 months they cannot open their schools. Even you are actually expert on uh, uh, like this tourism and other thing. Malaysia also a big country for tourism attraction and other things, but it's not moving forward. Now it's a very challenging moment, even though we are discussing on mobile computings. So how we can solve these things, how we can work together to solve this kind of challenges.
Thank you so much, Sharif. Thank you. What I want to say is how lucky we all are. We think that the whole world is with us on this. But the world is not with us. If you go to Africa, people not only don't have mobiles, they don't have internet, they don't have Wi-Fi. And we take this for granted now. I come from a generation that still remembers computers when there was a deck of cards to be put in a big machine. I was in Chicago at the time, IIT, and I remember in the 70s how this used to work. We've come a long way since then, but we only came that way. The world is not an equal world. There's a deficit of technology that we need to handle. This deficit is a big, serious deficit because the world assumes that anybody has a mobile, or anybody has a Wi-Fi. That's not right. We've just heard from the United States. Even in the United States, you don't have states that are as competent as other states. So I think what we need to do is make sure that the world is equal in this, because technology is not a one-time go. I agree with Rob 100%. COVID has pushed this thing further and has made us, put us on the challenge. Now, I tell you, this mobile thing is going to become more dominant, more affecting our lives. I got
Mhm.
my daughter married via Zoom, believe it or not. I was sitting in Amman, Jordan, where I am talking to you now, with the father of the groom. The two couple were in Dubai. The priest was on the third line, and we got them married like that because there is no other way to do it. So this technology is going to become more and more personalized. It's not just a matter of meetings like this. It's not just a matter of public events. It's private things. So unless the world comes together and provides this internet, this mobile ability to everybody in this world, we'll never go anywhere further. I just want to highlight the danger of inequality when it comes to technology. Because technology is not just about internet. Technology is something that has been with us for a long period of time as human beings. When man invented fire, that was technology. When we started to fly in the 20th century, that was technology. Today, technology only means the internet and the mobile and the Wi-Fi, which is not right and not fair for many people around the world. I'm not an expert in all of this, so I just speak about it in general terms, in terms of equality and affordability. I don't think that I work with people in Africa that I know don't have internet at all. So even if you give them mobiles, what would they do with it? It's not going to work,
Mhm.
unfortunately. Thank you so much. I'll stop at this point and I'm ready to receive any other comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Donald, how do you want to analyze this topic, and if you want to add some new points?
I will. Um, I should say that I started using the internet, the preview to the internet. People don't realize that there was a network called UUCP that was basically the backbone of what we considered the internet. And it was 1979 when I first started working with in Santa Cruz with somebody at Bell Laboratories developing a natural language parser. And we were doing it by very primitive methods. I had a terminal not a laptop. It was 300 baud. And to put it in perspective, right now it's about 3,000 times, my internet connection's about 3,000 times as much as it was. You just watch the characters sort of one at a time come on the screen. Anyway, that, I think that if you look at some of the uses of mobile technology that have been really helpful is you can go to countries in the world where they do have connectivity, but they don't have enough money to actually buy mobile phones. And so people set up businesses where they buy a mobile phone and then they can sell people time on the mobile phone. Other places, they've set up businesses charging mobile phones because there isn't enough electricity, but in that particular place, they do have some sort of connectivity that allow them to use it. One of the really cool technologies that came out of Africa is called M-Pesa. And what happened is that people realized that they could buy phone credit, but they could get reimbursed for it if they didn't use it. So what they would do is they'd buy phone credit in one town and then assign it to somebody else in a different town. And that way they developed a way that they could basically wire money long distance, actually before we were doing it much in the United States. And just in Africa, they figured out this system that has become so ubiquitous that it's been, banks have gotten into it and it's been duplicated all over the developing world. So I love things like that, the brilliant ways of growing from necessity and cleverness. I am part of a group at University of Oulu called Persuasive Technology, and we argue right from the beginning that something like those little things that now pop up on your computer every time you log into a site saying, give us your email address, blah, 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 we believe that's a kind of persuasion, but it's kind of an annoying persuasion. It persuades you to be pissed off, at least me, but it might persuade you to give the email address. In any event, what we're really interested in is human-computer interaction at a UI level, or how it affects organizations or countries or other, all kinds of things we're interested in. And the latest research that I've just gotten so excited by is the reconception of us as human beings. And what that is it's called embodied cognition. And it's the whole idea that our minds aren't located in our skulls like some disembodied whatever. They're actually part of our bodies, and our bodies are constantly interacting with the world around them. So in a sense, one of the great philosophers of this, Andy Clark, says that he talks about somebody with Alzheimer's and somebody else. One can remember things without aid, but then the other one writes down everything that he needs to remember so that he can find it again. And Andy Clark argues, well, they're the same thing. They're memory. And so if you look at that view, then you can start looking at mobile devices in this amazing way, which is that they become part of us. They become what we would call a mind or a consciousness, they're part of us. They're not separate from us. We don't. And so I think that if we start thinking of it that way, we start realizing an incredible amount of responsibility that we have to try and understand what we're doing. Like I've been developing classes for Zoom, and the most widely used for the web, and the most widely used web platform is WordPress, and there's no decent learning thing for WordPress that works well. And so we've got a long way to go to be able to start using it for things like education. We're, everyone has said, we've gone a long, long way. Um, and I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to get back to some of the points
Thank you,
later.
thank you, thank you. Mr. Manuel, how do you want to analyze today's topic? And if you want to share some of your experience from Africa, what's going on inside, so it will be helpful for us for analyze.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. So yeah, I would like to add few points on the implementation of mobile computing, like some of our guest speakers mentioned it, like through cloud computing, edge computing. But also, I would say the one of the characteristics that we can see with the mobile computing is the individuality. Sorry, is the individuality and the privacy, and also the connectivity, which is one of the reason we are able to have this meeting. So yeah, it's also the connectivity and some of the different applications through the Internet of Things. So mobile computing is really crucial through Internet of Things. And today I would like to focus a little bit on the satellite-based applications of mobile computing, because I think most of our guest speaker mentioned Africa today, and one of the big issues in Africa about development is the internet access, because when we are talking about e-commerce, we are talking about Internet of Things, we are talking about digitization, we are talking about digital transformation. What is primary is the internet access. So in collaboration with the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs and the Space Generation Advisory Council, we are trying to build an ecosystem where we can try to lead that transition between the classical telecommunication and the satellite-based telecommunication. We can try to explain to the government how using satellite-based technologies it can become cheaper, and they can have more access to the internet than they have right now. And I believe yesterday we mentioned it during the distributed manufacturing part, that because of 3D printing, now it's easier for developing countries to have their own satellites in orbit. But one of the problems that we are facing is that most of the governments, they they focus on the classical telecommunications, like I mentioned, and they don't want to make that transition. And like you know that the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, they have two main subdivision: the Space Generation Advisory Council and the UN COPUS, the Committee for Peaceful Use of Space. And in the Committee of Peaceful Use of Space, we have some diplomats, some delegates that are implementing the vision of the organization in Europe and the other continents. But when we come to Africa, the UN COPUS is not active, because the the minister, the government, they are not really interested into what the satellite-based application can actually bring. So it's like the younger generation, the Space Generation Advisory Council, we actually have to do the work that UN COPUS is doing on the other continent. We have to handle that part, and it's a bit challenging. But still, I would like to add that during this COVID pandemic, most of the African countries, they have been using satellite data, satellite imagery for many applications, for farming, and especially for um, yeah, to track water in the desert. If we take the Sahara Desert, there have been some crises, water crises, where there are some private companies who are proposing some mobile applications where they can use to locate the water in the desert. And we've seen that in English-speaking countries of Africa, there is more of growth in the space industry, but in the French speaking countries it's a bit so challenging, and this is what we are trying to improve more and more today. So um, one more thing I would like to add is the importance of uh, having a collaboration with the policymakers, because they need to understand how if having satellite-based technologies can actually improve the mobile computing, can actually improve the internet access, and what growth that can bring to the economy. So that's also really important. And also the regulations. There should be regulations upon the different companies that are already existing, so that because some of the private companies in Africa, their internet is overpriced. Like, it's really expensive. So the regulation is needed, not only for Africa but for other developing countries as well. It's
Mhm.
important to have some regulation to limit those private companies. And to add more futuristic way, I would say that in the future, talking about mobile computing, a new technologies that is coming in is the quantum computing, that most of the developed countries are focusing on right now, because it's more secured, and in the upcoming years it's going to bring a lot of advancements in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you,
Manuel,
thank you.
where are you calling
Yes,
from, Manuel? Where
Thank
are
you.
you
Thank you,
based?
sir.
Manuel,
Where are
uh,
you
where are you
based?
based?
okay, I'm actually from Togo, but currently I'm based in India.
Good.
I'm based in India.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Manuel.
Yes, yes. Even Manuel also help World Talent Economy Forums, because next week we have a special episode on satellites and this kind of technology. This is also important for developing nations. And our sessions regularly we are sharing many developing nations directly Prime Minister office, and they are regularly observing our show, and they hopefully in the futures policy making and this type of things we can work together and we can help different developing nations, and it will be very effective for total developments. Professor David, actually Manuel's being many interesting point of satellite internet connections, Africans especially present situations, uh, it's a good example of developing nations. So how do we solve this problem? Because now education, uh, I think that day by day we have to be very much focused on internet, mobile computings and this kind of thing. No choice, we have to go that. And even though I know that South Asian data, only last 1 years they lose $1 trillion in education industry, only because of they have lack of internet connections or good infrastructures and these things. How can we solve that? How the developing nations work? Or we want some fast solution, not like after 1 to 3 years, because we need some fast solution.
Last mile internet access is a challenge outside of places where you have dense population.
Mhm,
Is it a challenge for actually providing the access?
mhm,
Not really, but it's a challenge for commercial companies to see where there's rate of return. A great analogy is going back across the United States when the phone network began to expand across the country. And the government had to put in a special fund to subsidize the distribution of telephone into the rural environment. Uh, as Manuel said, satellite is one of the options that we're seeing deployed quite a bit now. But satellite has its own set of challenges and its own set of very good things about it as well. Uh, One of the solutions that we're working with to pull internet access into rural environments is actually building mesh networks and mesh networks using some non-traditional bandwidth to do it. One of the advantages of a mesh network is that it's basically a peer-to-peer network, in that each of the connections feed with each other and have route redundancy getting to the people in the rural environment. We're doing a couple of installations where what we're doing is we're using a concept called TV white band space, where, particularly in the rural environment, not a lot of the television frequencies used, because once again, it doesn't have the population density to support that. But it has some significant bandwidth things in there that can be used point to point to deliver internet very efficiently, as opposed to running fiber optics cables, running coax through the ground or through poles and other infrastructure like that. The other approach used a lot today is millimeter wave propagation to connect the pods which are in that network. I think in a lot of the rural environment, that might be even a more preferred solution than satellite, because using approaches like that, there's now companies building devices that will let you put them in those nodes. These are cloud computing devices that will bring processing power out to the end of those nodes. And in the rural environments, as opposed to backhauling to large data centers, a lot of the local things can be done there. And some of the real interesting applications of this in these node networks is particularly bringing telehealth services into it, bringing new market type making services in it, where there's limited computer resources there for them to use. And it's local, where they can connect their sensors, other things like that, which, again, one of the challenges with satellite is actually doing that type of connectivity locally, besides just pure internet access. And so there's a lot of different approaches, but I love what Donald said, was that it's one that has grown over time, and it is a necessity. I too agree with him. My first mobile computer was a Texas Instruments Silent 700 terminal, where you took the handset from your telephone and put it in these rubber cups, and it used thermal printing paper. And that's how we got internet, how we got access back to do computing. And yes, I had one of those big metal K-Pros too. My probably next to the oldest computer I have still is an old compact mobile computer, where the screen is a 5-inch orange CRT. And boy, I thought that was advanced at the time. But as you begin to go through them, though, we adapted back then to the low bandwidths, and we were able to use them. A lot of development today is really only focusing on high bandwidth as you look at their applications. But we do have large parts of the world, as Manuel and others have said, where we do not have that high bandwidth. So I think there's actually a marketplace for developers, entrepreneurs, to look at, particularly again in the rural environment, in the underdeveloped environment, of producing applications for use in this mobile workspace area that take advantage of low bandwidth, that can be able to use that to elevate the economic well-being, the educational well-being, the opportunity well-being of these mobile environments in the low density areas, the rural areas, that can help elevate the whole net worth of that population.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what kind of solutions we have, and you have a deep understanding about technology. Even previous session we do discuss on Starlink and this kind of thing, but how fast we can get solution?
Well, when you say how fast, the problem with deploying any new technology is having the competency to deploy it properly. Our industry has a repetitive problem of people getting excited about stuff before they understand it. And the end result is awful lot of the early deployments of anything fail. I remember back in the 80s when we were talking about client server computing and how successful it was, and then doing a survey in the mid 90s about how successful it was. And the two things were very different. We were talking about just that you had to do client server computing was really great. Mainframes were dead. Blah, 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 blah. And then it turned out when you did the post, that most of those client server deployments were just horrid. And then again, in the 90s, Microsoft had an event that was tied, it was called Scalability Day. And they showcased that Windows NT servers could outperform mainframes. And I did one of the calls, I think it was to one of the big tire companies, Firestone, if I was correct. And I was talking to him, and he said, yeah, well, a couple things. He said, that's right. These Windows NT servers are better than my mainframe was. He said, but if I'd had to pay for them, they would have also cost 3 or 4 times what my mainframe cost. Which I found kind of interesting that he was referencing out. But anyway, the fact is, and then eventually, of course, in 2000, we figured it all out, and now Windows-based servers are not dominant, but certainly prevalent. Linux tends to play pretty aggressively on servers, and now we're going to the kind of a next phase of technology. We're talking about moving into the cloud, and when we're talking about a developing environment, the cloud's pretty attractive, assuming you can solve the connectivity problem. The reason is you can then co-locate your computing resources. You can secure those resources in a secure location so that you can protect the data, protect the hardware so it doesn't get stolen. And then you shift the support loading from the devices that are distributed and often in remote areas that lack support, and certainly you're unable to roll trucks, to a lot of the effort is back in that cloud environment where you can have folks work where it's safe, where they can put in place, if you've got a COVID problem, you can put in place practices to protect them. And best, you don't have to roll a truck, because a lot of the folks in emerging countries, they're not places that are easily accessed. So being able to provide a computing service to those areas now becomes critical, and that's how you do it. Now, you still have to worry about how do you get the signal to those areas. And you mentioned satellite. Satellite originally didn't look too promising, primarily because of an uplink problem. You could get substantial data performance downlink. It means the data coming into you was more than adequate, but what you paid was the uplink was very slow and latency was horrible. I mean, playing a video game on a satellite, on one of the old Hughes satellite deployments, you just wouldn't do it. It was marginally better than ISDN, but I use the word marginally with some concern. Because it really kind of having been on both, it was just bad. The new Starlink stuff is actually pretty good. The uplink is as good as some people actually have with wired broadband. The latency is low enough so people are reporting that they can play games, and while it's not as good as somebody that has a fiber connection to the home, or even a high-speed coax connection to the home, it's still a hell of a lot better than anything we've had before with regard to satellite performance. So it's looking very promising. The concern about Starlink is how well it can scale. It's very promising with relatively low loading right now. What we discovered, particularly as we moved to 5G, the one company and one of the reasons why Huawei, I think, was attacked as broadly as they were, was the one company that figured out that it was the backhaul that was going to be the problem when you moved to high bandwidth was Huawei. And in their cellular solution, they solved it with a very high bandwidth wireless backhaul that bypassed the existing infrastructure. And so it became very popular. Folks got nervous that Huawei was going to own the environment. And I think that resulted in Huawei receiving a series of attacks that are based on information that to date hasn't been proven. One of the weirdest things I've ever seen, where governments get involved in bad-mouthing a company, but without actually any proof that they did anything wrong. But I'm hoping this will be an unusual event, because it's what comes around goes around. But in any case, so the 5G stuff looks particularly promising as well. And the thing isn't so much bandwidth and latency; it's performance at the edge. What 5G brings, well, two things: performance at the edge and security. What 5G brings is higher performance at the edge. Right now, 4G and LTE performance drops off dramatically at the edge of the network, and a lot of these communities that are remote are at the very least at the edge of the network of missing coverage. And so by bringing up performance to the edge, it makes it far more attractive. And so as these 5G networks go in, we get the opportunity to provide bandwidth that a lot of areas have not been able to see or use. But it doesn't come without a cost, and the government still has to deploy it. And a lot of times the cost is based, unlike wired networks, is based on the amount of data that you put through the network. And that sometimes is unpalatable to the subscriber, particularly in areas where they don't have a ton of money to begin with. So working through the economics of this is going to be problematic in emerging economies. And it very well may be that, much like water and power are provided as kind of basic utilities, that in a lot of areas that connectivity will be the same. Now, here in the United States, where cities have tried to put this in, the lobbies, the telephony lobbies have gone in and successfully made that kind of practice illegal. So cities in many states aren't legally able to become their own ISP, which is kind of problematic. And it can show the problem with regard to large companies getting too much control over the environment, because then a more effective, more cost-effective, more affordable solution may not come in where a municipality may allow it. In fact, in some of the municipalities that are talking about putting in their own networks, it's not like the carriers are putting in those networks. They're just too expensive. They're rural areas. It costs too much to drop cable. And so these people are unserved, which are why the cities wanted to put in their own cable and their own service, but they're blocked by law from doing so. And now the citizens just don't have access. It's not they don't have access to, they can't afford the access. It's not that they're being blocked from access. It's the access doesn't exist, and the people that want to put it in can't. So that's where some of the satellite providers like Starlink may be able to cut in and provide this solution, because they can get around these laws because they don't apply to them. They're not a city, and still provide access to people that currently don't have it. But one of the big issues we have in the world right now is there are way too many people that have access that don't have access. And the other thing we've got is of course, with access comes a proliferation of bad information. So the other problem we've got is when we provide people with access, assuring that the information they're getting is at least moderately accurate, and it's not propaganda that's leading them into doing things they otherwise wouldn't do and that are bad for them. But that's a whole different topic.
Thank you. Professor Talib Raphael. Fact is that whatever we are discussing right now, government has very, very important role right now. And this challenging moment, it's actually important that how they show their capacities and other things. I think every country is right now, government has to take more responsibilities. It's not only developing nations, also the developed nations. What is your advice? What is your guidelines? How government can play properly in this challenging moment?
Governments are playing the real game here, because governments at the end of the day are the ones that take the decisions. And we cannot avoid that. It's part of the network of things. But what I want to talk about here is the issue of privacy and how different it is from one country to another, one government to another. The issue of privacy is not being discussed enough here. I think we need to focus a little bit more on that, because in developing countries, privacy is not an issue. But in developed countries, privacy comes up to the top. It's the nature of the system. And governments have a lot to do with that. And governments would like to control everything and get all the information that they can, I think. Rob and David, can you talk a little bit about privacy, please?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, privacy. Well, privacy is certainly important. One of the big issues, of course, right now that the world is dealing with is what's happening with the data that's being collected from individuals. The large companies make a habit of collecting data. In fact, it's how they pay the bills. Google's entire revenue model is based on advertising. Facebook's entire revenue model is largely based on advertising. And that creates not only a moral dilemma, but an economic one, and because the people that are paying for the service are not the people that are using the service. And so
right.
in many cases, the individual, the people that think of themselves as customers are not. They're the product. Google sells you as the product to advertisers, who then make use of your data to convince you to buy stuff, or manipulate you. If it's a political body that's making the payment for the data, they're getting the data so that they can influence you to vote in a particular fashion. And this level of manipulation is, I mean, really the government should be much more solidly standing behind it. It is my belief that your information is yours, and if it's not yours, then it's a resource that belongs to the state first, not private companies. But we bypass that, and we provide our private information without thinking of its value, and we get back a set of services that are massively profitable for the entity that's providing them. And that I mean, a lot of us are struggling with that at the moment. Several new companies are coming up with this idea of compensating you for the data that you provide, but I'm still not sure that's the correct way to do it, because it's being used, because the data is being used to manipulate. That creates an inherent danger, whether we're talking about it in terms of a political danger or just a danger of folks that are behaving contrary to their best interests through manipulation. It's not good for the country. So it is an ongoing problem and balance. People like these free services, though, so stepping in and taking away those free services in an effort to better contain the privacy would not be popular with most of them at the moment. We have a serious problem. The vast majority of us don't understand the nature of the problem, and because of that, government is unwilling to act decisively to mitigate it, and this will be going certainly for the rest of this decade, as we struggle to balance the needs of the individuals with a profit mechanism that we developed for the internet.
But Rob, you think governments can do something?
Oh, can is not an issue. Absolutely can do it. Having the will to do it is the problem. Taking services away from people that want those services, even if those services are costing them more than they realize, and should be unaffordable if you think about it in terms of manipulation. It's not the way governments, at least not democratic governments, work, primarily because it would cost them their constituency, that people would be voted out of office if they did it, even though it would truly be in the best interest of their citizens. And this goes back to the issue with regard to propaganda. The nature of it right now is fairly well pronounced, and people are being so easily manipulated that giving up that power, either by a company or a government entity, I think is virtually impossible to see happen unless we came up with a completely different structure of oversight and enforcement than we currently have.
Yes.
And even the concept of privacy has interesting roots, because I will often tell people when we talk about privacy that we gave up privacy when we moved to currency. From when we bartered, we moved to currency. And that was a place where privacy suffered. Well, we're not going to go back and deal without currency again. And now, as we are moving more to pure electronic currency and the cryptocurrency and things, you have to give up privacy, really, to have a system that is accountable. And even using blockchain and other technologies there.
Do you see a difference between developing and developed countries, governments in that attitude?
Oh, very much so. And you see them because of the way they treat the areas for control. It's like people ask me about the adoption of Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies. The biggest problem to the adoption of that is the national banks of countries, because the national banks use their own currency manipulation to maintain the economy, and part of that goes away as you begin to do crypto. Nation states use access to information to control their economy, much the same way as national banks use their currency to maintain the economy too. So even though we want the full access, like Rob talked about, there is a balancing act in government between how much privacy, how much full access to information, how much commercial pressure will we allow? If I look at Google, if I look at Amazon, if I look at Facebook, if I look at all of those services are made available at their low cost because we give up privacy.
Yes.
We give up control. And it's a balancing act between how much is too much. I mean, I personally do not use Chrome much anymore. I don't use Google search anymore. And I've gone to other browsers, I've gone to other search tools just to gain back some control of my privacy. But that is not a ubiquitous type of application. There's times I shudder to say this, I have to go and use Google search because I'm looking at something the other ones are just not as deep in. And that type of access is, again, I give up privacy to go do that. So it's a decision that's not just a government decision, it's an individual decision as well. But governments do have a key role.
Thank
you. Thank you. Professor Donald.
Well, I really agree with what David and Rob have been saying about privacy. You have to understand that privacy is in a sense, a personal judgment or basically a cultural judgment. So young people today, or all ages people today, don't think twice about putting up photographs of them doing this or that, or talking about their lives and things like that. And they do it voluntarily. I mean, that's what Facebook and Twitter and all these things, that's what they allow you to do. Instagram, right? All of them. And people, so what privacy means to them is not the same thing that privacy means to maybe somebody like, David obviously is very concerned about it. If you go to Europe and the European Union, places like, as I said, I worked in Finland. Finland has very strong rules about privacy on the internet, and they have like, I wanted to do some research where I was studying the social network patterns between people, and they said, well, you can't do that. You can't do that in Finland. It's just, it's against the law, and it's against their mores. And Finns are very, very private people, and they didn't want it, and so they don't allow it. And even Google is restricted in the data that they are allowed to collect in Finland. I mean, and theoretically we could do that as well. One of the things that's been very important about, especially post-COVID days, is that we can do things like we're doing right now. But it's important to understand that knowledge and education isn't a matter of a teacher talking like a radio tower and the people being like tape recorders that are recording all this knowledge that's being sent to them. What has to happen is that you have to take what you've learned and then talk to somebody about it. See how what you've learned affects the world. See if you're accurate or not. You have to basically create the knowledge through interaction. You can't, it doesn't stand on its own. And so the things like this allow us to do it, but they're limited in some ways, because when we get a group this large, we can't really have a discussion exactly. We all talk for a while, and then the next person talks for a while. When I'm doing it one-on-one with consulting or teaching, we can do that. And a huge advantage is that we can see each other's faces. It's very difficult when you're just listening to somebody, because we have interaction clues where we talk and we say, okay, this person's finished, and then the next person's going to start. And even in this case, we pretty much when we're finished talking, we say, okay, I'm finished talking, so that we can know that it's time for the next person to do it. So we've got a long ways to go in that respect. And back to privacy, again, it's what your expectations are. Like right now, they say if you're on Facebook when you're applying for a job, you should delete your Facebook account because the things that you did in college could come back to haunt you, the parties that you went to or whatever you did. And I believe that in some short number of years, everybody will have done something like that. And the fact that the person that's hiring you won't be as judgmental. They won't consider it as bad of a thing. It's going to start switching. It's just the level of what it basically what you want to keep private is information about yourself, and the question. You're always willing to let some information about yourself out when you're talking to people. You say, "Oh, what's your job? What do you do? Where did you go to school?" Things like that. People are willing to share that information with most people, anybody. So where does that limit of what you allow people to share? And what I think is happening is that limit is changing, but what he's talking about autocratic governments and people that can use that information to control you that's a very difficult problem to solve. Because I'm just going to finish up with saying one thing. I believed when we started this show, I believed that the most important thing that we could do was education. And now I've come to start believing that really what the most important thing we can do is be able to start addressing inequality. And again, I keep going back to Finland because Finland developed a system where you can't have Bill Gates. That's a drawback in some sense, but is it really? They're one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world. I mean, somehow they make it work. But teachers are more respected there than doctors. And people that are tradespeople, that do the work, that do things that don't necessarily have college degrees, are supported with, and they're respected. And also, they don't make so much less money than everyone else that you look down on them in a hierarchy where money is the measure of your value. And so besides the issue of governments that misbehave, and that can happen anywhere. I mean, look what just happened here. And besides that, we need to. I think we need to. Well, we have this theory that if you're educated, you're going to rise to the top. You're going to become economically better off. And that you become a better person. And I think that we need to really rethink what we're doing there and start understanding that there's value in everyone, because it's destabilizing the world, that view. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel.
Okay, thank you so much. What I would like to add here is, like our guest speakers mentioned it, for developed countries, the bigger issue is the privacy. But if we take developing countries, it's the propaganda of fake informations. For example, if we take some of the developing countries, now they have some internet access. It's not stable. It's not high band, but yeah, they have it, and they can use the social media platforms. And because of that, now the fake informations, the misinformations are being spread like over the internet. For example, if we take the cryptocurrencies, now people are being come and and like because they don't have the real information. If we take French speaking countries, when they go online, most of the informations about the technologies are in English. So it's like they will go for another website where they can find the same information in French, but on that website maybe they will be getting a fake information. And I remember when COVID-19 started, there was actually a video that was made by the airport of Senegal in 2018 on how to manage a crisis, a pandemic crisis, or epidemic crisis in case it happens. And like it was just a test that they made, and there were people who were having seizure um, in the video just to practice in case it happens. Now, when the COVID-19 pandemic came into 2020, people actually went and downloaded those same video, and they shared it online saying that it's actually COVID-19 and people were having seizure at the Senegal airport. So it's like sometimes people will not be able to access the real information. So because of that, they will just focus on what is being shared on social media, and they can get misinformed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today, but next week we have more interesting sessions. Even we are arranging like smart city and smart tourism discussions next week. I think Dr. Talib Rafael will join these sessions. Beside that, we have sessions on satellites as well as different kind of technologies, and the climate change also are one of our major target, and we discuss on that area. So thank you everyone for joining today's session, and that their audience, those who are observing today's shows, this is very, very important, because the technological insight you can understand. There are many misconceptions. There are many things, even sometimes our governments, even the many high officials, they have misconcept. But how actually our panelists, they discuss about the inside of the technology, this is very helpful. And this way we can solve many problems. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks today. Professor Rob, I request you for the concluding remarks. Then Dr. Talib Rafael, Professor Donald, and finally Mr. Manuel. Professor Rob.
Sure. Mobile computing enabled us to do things we were never able to do out of the office. It allowed us the flexibility to work where we wanted. And it wasn't until the pandemic that we really started to use that flexibility. Often with mobile computers, you still ended up using them in an office, in a schoolroom, in an enclosed area. And with the pandemic, we discovered we could use them outside. We could work from our living room, so we could work from our kitchens if we had to. We really started to explore kind of the advances and limitations of mobile computing, and even the devices we use changed rather dramatically. We increasingly use smartphones for an awful lot of activities, and while PCs weren't dead and didn't go away, we discovered the bigger screen does make a big difference. We live a much more balanced in terms of hardware life, but a much less balanced life in terms of work-life balance. What we found is work was intruding on our private life, and the quality of our lives arguably decreased even as our productivity went up. We mentioned privacy and the use of data, but what I didn't talk about was the fact with all this data being collected, it could actually do us some good if it was applied that way. For instance, if I was having a stroke or a heart attack or in the early throes of it, analytics would show us as I worked that I had some kind of a disability, and the computer could warn me that I need to get to a hospital fast or get help fast before I entirely shut down. But that hasn't been applied. It could also analyze how I write and tell me that I might have a substance abuse problem. I could early on cite Alzheimer's. I mean, there are a bunch of things that technology could do with the data that it's collecting that would do me good that it's not doing. And I think that's probably an easier thing to accomplish than to restrict access to personal data. Once we went on the internet, we kind of gave that up. I often see the meme on the internet about the fact that as soon as we pick, about the vaccines, talking about how the vaccines are somehow monitoring your activity, and the counter is, hey, when you got a smartphone, you basically installed a super sensor in your body. If you're worried about monitoring, it's gone way too far, way too fast. So in the end, there are appropriate ways to use the information that's being collected, ways that could make our lives better, could help us do work-life balance, could help us build better relationships, that could help us be better people. But we're not really using it that way. Right now, the collection of data is largely being used to manipulate us to do things, from buying products to vote for candidates that might not be in our best interest. And that I see as the core problem to the privacy and data collection area. Going forward, the evolution of mobile computing has now been accelerated, as we mentioned, by at least 5 years. That means we're going to be seeing things like head-mounted displays, embedded technology, and the rest 5 years earlier than we thought. So we're all evolving our timelines with regard to that. So the 2030s are suddenly going to be a lot more interesting, because it's going to have a series of advancements we weren't expecting to the 2040s, and we are not ready for them. So as you approach and you go through your school courses, what I advise you to do is capture as much breadth on the technology as you possibly can, and can possibly understand the underlying trends, and then gauge the things that you like and don't like effectively, so that you can plan your academic life and your future work life effectively. At the end of the day, don't let this technology take away your personality. Don't take away your smile or the fun you have in life. Find ways to use technology to make your life better and to make for a happier life. And if you learn those skills early, when this stuff hits you over the head in about 5 or 10 years in ever increasing masses, you'll be better able to survive the change.
Thank you. Dr. Talib Rafael, what's your concluding remarks? Besides that,
Thank you.
this is our 306 episodes. You have a very huge influence around the world. So hopefully you also request your peoples and around the world that they can observe World Talent Economy Forum shows, and we do more focus on modern science, modern engineering, and modern technology. We are trying to advocating the most of the modern things, and we are trying to help more developing nations. Even our speakers, they also join like you. They are willing to solve many problems, and we are working together. So your support is really, really great for World Talent Economy Forum. So what's your concluding remarks for today?
Thank you so much. I completely agree with you, Mr. Sharif. Completely agree with you. I think Rob's conclusion is a very good conclusion. What he's saying is that we should all try to make technology work for us, not us working for it. We should make it humanize it. And with regard to privacy or the manipulation of information, I think we should distinguish between two things. Number one is, what is the meaning of my own privacy versus others? We in developing countries, and I come from a developing country, don't care much about the issue of privacy as the people of Finland, for example, like Donald said, care much about it. But we care a lot about governments manipulating this information to influence us. These are two different things. My own privacy is one thing, and the manipulation of the information to affect me is another thing. I think we should be conscious and aware of this. I'm asking each and every one of you young people to be quite aware of that, and to work very hard to distinguish between the two, and to humanize technology, as Rob said. Technology must not take away our smile, must not take away our ability to influence things. We are human beings, after all. We were the ones that created all of this. It was created for us, not us for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Talib. Professor Donald, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I very much agree with what Rob and Dr. Talib just said, and as I said, I'm part of a group, Persuasive Technology, at the University of Oulu, and what we're talking about here with propaganda is persuasive technology, where people have gotten incredibly good at understanding what subconscious things that you can do that create people's views. I have a friend, I don't know how we managed to stay friends, but he is totally into the very right-wing, anti-immigrant, blah, blah, blah stuff. And he told me he wanted to prove that New York Times and Washington Post and The Economist and everything were lying. And
Fake
so he
news.
gave me he gave me a book, or he pointed me to a book by the editor of Breitbart, which is an ultra right wing organization in the United States that's, again, anti-immigrant and all that kind of stuff. And he said, well, it's very well researched. It's got footnotes. So I got it and I looked at the footnotes, and all the footnotes were to Breitbart. So basically, it's like writing your own letters of recommendation. You say, oh, I'm applying for a job. And he says, well, I need 3 letters of recommendation. You say, okay, I'll write them tonight. I mean, that's not the way it works. And people's ability, how we can get people's ability to go past that, it's an emotional thing, not a intellectual thing. And in fact, this book that I've just been reading, I can't recommend too highly. It's called The Tyranny of Merit. And when I go to him and I say to him, well, you're not doing the correct kind of research, since I have an advanced degree and he doesn't even, I don't even think he has a college degree, in a way, I'm putting him down. I'm making him less and me more. And that's because I have credentials and I've traveled all over the world and all those kinds of things. And so I just kind of wonder how we can develop approaches that work with people's their social status, their emotional states, the worlds that they live in. And I think mobile computing can really help, because I've heard the expression years ago that it's hard to hate close up. And when you actually interact with somebody, it's much, much harder to hate them than if there's some abstract other over there somewhere that's, that you've told stories about that make them become evil. And so one hope for the mobile computing and the ability for us to connect with each other is that we can double check our governments. We can talk to people in other countries and find out what they think. And that's the way I feel that I'm able to get more accurate information, as I cross-check it in a zillion different ways. And I think that's one hope for mobile computing. But in the end, it goes back to what Rob and Talib have just said, which is that it's about you and about you have to try and understand like how it's affecting you, and dedicate yourself to having fun in life and enjoying life, because you only go through once. And if you kind of waste it being manipulated by other people, you'll probably not regret it, because we all are happy about, most of us are happy about our lives, but you can be so much more, and you can be part of the solution too. So that's my advice.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And for my concluding remarks, I would like to add that it's important to look into the ethics and the social responsibility parts of the mobile computing, not only for the private companies, but also by the policymakers. And also the policymakers can also collaborate with the experts in the field to develop a plan or some objective that is how to implement those technologies for their sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's session. Today we've just finished 306 episode. I request everyone share our content as much as possible with your government, with your corporations, with your academy. it will be very, very helpful, because World Talent Economy Forum, we are advocate for modern science, modern engineering, and modern technology. And we love to work for grassroots level people and the youth communities, those who are the futures. And we always believe that open dialogue is the solution for many things. We have a lot of challenge, but if we sit together, if we go for the open dialogue, we can solve many problems around the world. So this is the way we are practicing, and we are like you can see that every session, like a lot of global famous speaker, they just join with World Talent Economy Forum, and they just sharing their knowledge, views, and everything. This is very, very helpful for the developing nations, and I want to say the Asia Pacific community. Thank you, Dr. Talib Rafael, for your valuable times and for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Mr. Rob, for your brilliant effort for World Talent Economy Forum from day one. Professor Donalds, always you love to support World Talent Economy Forum. And my friend, Mr. Manuels, we are open for collaborations and any good projects, we are open for that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Hey,
Bye.
thanks.